the Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Luke DeWolf.
And I'm Dan Larrabee.
Today, we're continuing our series on the Kalevala with Kalevala Runo 9, the origin of iron. In this story, we ended off the last time with Väinämöinen having grievously wounded himself with his axe while trying to impress the maiden of Pohjola. But now he's gone and found a man, an old man, who supposedly is able to take care of his wound. And so we're going to see what happens when Väinämöinen and this old man get together and maybe they have a chat and we talk about some interesting things. So I'm excited about this one.
Me too. Always a good time to, when we're in the land of heroes. So it'll be good to get into it and see how Väinämöinen gets himself out of this mess.
Absolutely. So before we get into today's episode, we are excited to announce that we are now sponsored by Grimfrost. Grimfrost is absolutely our favorite source of Norse and Viking products. We've been a fan of theirs for a really long time, like basically since they started up. And we're just super thrilled to be able to tell you about them if you don't know who they are. They're based in Sweden and they have a huge selection of historical Viking reproductions, as well as contemporary products inspired by Viking Age culture. They do ship worldwide, just like the Vikings used to. And just like our show, they aim to build a bridge between the past and the present, bringing relevant parts of Old Norse culture into today's world. So we're just a huge fan of that. That's basically everything that we are about. So they're a fantastic company. They've got great shirts, great apparel. Like the shirts I've been wearing, a lot of them, if they're not band shirts, they're basically Grimfrost's products. And this is like from the beginning. So we've been huge fans of their work for a really long time. They got great beard care products. I've got like a really nice Grimfrost comb that's like made out of bone. It's really, really cool. They've also got these drinking horns and just all this cool stuff. If you go on their website, they just have loads of stuff to offer.
The drinking horns are impressive because they've got the single serving size and then like the good time size, but then they also have like enough, like the size for an army. It's awesome.
It really is. They're just fantastic. They're great people, and again, like based in Sweden, and they really want to go for the whole reproduction thing, and all their contemporary stuff is awesome too. They even got like gym gear that's really good quality stuff. So yeah, loads of good things, and yeah, their website is grimfrost.com. That's Grim and Frost spelled as it sounds, and we'll of course put a link in the description. And they're actually the publisher of the awesome new intro and outro music that we have right now too. That's Talk by Folke Bortefur Nordavinnen, and I'll put that in the description as well. I'm not going to spell that out, but no, they're just awesome, and we couldn't be more proud to have a sponsorship with them. So check out Grimfrost; they're awesome.
Absolutely, I'm super happy that they're sponsoring us and that we're working with them.
Definitely. And the other way, of course, that you can help the show is we do have a Patreon page now. The Patreon is 100% the best way you can support us if you would like. We offer a couple of things to Patreon supporters, especially early access to episodes. Basically, as soon as I'm done editing them, we upload them and you get to see all the work we do a little bit earlier. And we also try and do a little bit of behind the scenes stuff as well. You get a little bit of a picture of how the podcast gets produced and the cool things that we're up to before we announce it on social media and things like that. And every little bit goes towards upgrades for the podcast. Like right now, we're working towards getting some new microphones. The ones we have are pretty good, but they were kind of a stopgap. We originally had Blue Yetis, and we had no idea that it was basically completely not good for our use case. It would have been fine if we used one, but using two, we had so much crosstalk between the two. So the microphones we have now are like an emergency replacement to make it a little bit better, but we definitely want to get something better. And so that's the first thing that we would look at, and just a couple of other things to make sure that we've got backups of our recordings and that we have a little bit of a better way to produce the show, things like that. We want to get some software eventually that's a little bit better for the editing, make it a bit easier. So that's all what we're working towards, and that's what all the Patreon money would go towards if you want to support us. So that's definitely the best way you can do that, and it's just going towards making the show even better.
Absolutely. And, pie in the sky dream here is that who knows, maybe one day we're able to take the show on the road and do live shows of going through these myths and multimedia presentations and all that. So, fingers crossed. But right now it's just to make sure that we're putting out the best produced podcast that we can.
Exactly. So those are the long-term goals, but in the short term as well, we're definitely doing some stuff pretty early on here, and we're definitely going to be making use of all the support right away. So that's the best way you can support us. That's patreon.com/Northern Myths. Again, link in the description for sure. And of course, the other ways that you can get a hold of us are through Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or some variation on Northern Myths or Northern Myths podcast on all of those platforms. We're also on YouTube. A subscribe on YouTube is always appreciated. And of course, reviews on all platforms, wherever you get your podcasts, that's always appreciated. On iTunes especially is really helpful for us to just get in front of more people. So if you have a chance to take 2 minutes and write a quick review for us, we'd really appreciate that. Okay, I think we've talked enough about all of our little housekeeping and things like that and the ways you can support us. I think it's time to get into the poem.
Absolutely. Let's dive into the Kalevala.
Let's do it. Again, this is Kalevala Runo 9, The Origin of Iron. This is going to be lines 1 to 24. Back to the poem. Then the aged Väinämöinen in the sledge at once stood upright. From the sledge he sprang unaided and courageously stood upright. To the room he hastened quickly, and beneath the roof he hurried. There they brought a silver beaker, and a golden goblet likewise. But they proved by far too little, holding but the smallest measure of the blood of aged Väinä. From the hero's foot that spouted. From the stove the old man mumbled, cried the greybeard when he saw him. Who among mankind mayest thou be? Who among the roll of heroes? 7 large boats with blood are brimming, 8 large tubs are overflowing from your knee, O most unhappy. On the floor in torrents gushing. Other words I well remember, but the oldest I recall not, how the iron was first created and the unworked ore was fashioned. What do you think of that, Dan?
Well, my first reaction is I'm still feeling bad for Väinämöinen because taking an axe wound to the knee doesn't sound like much fun. And the amount of blood that he's bleeding is tremendous. And I saying that I love the imagery is kind of weird because it's just, blood pouring out. But the idea that, you can't fill it up, where you can't use a silver beaker or a golden goblet, it kind of shows you that it's not going to be a Band-Aid solution here for this. This is a serious wound. And if you recall, we recapped a bit, but, Väinämöinen was traveling to Pohja to find a wife. And he met, I'm going to pronounce it wrong probably, but Louhi. Louhi. Wow. See, I told you. Louhi. And she said, she helped him out of the water because he had fallen into the water because of Youkahainen. And you can see all of these, you can get like the detailed versions of this in our past episodes, but it's episodic, so it's kind of neat. But it's important because the reason why Väinämöinen has an axe wound is because he didn't listen to Louhi. He wasn't supposed to look up from the sledge as it was traveling back to his home. And then, as it often is with men, there was a beautiful maiden, and he poked his head up and wanted to check her out, thus breaking the rule that he wasn't allowed to look outside of his sledge. And then a little bit later on, really out of nowhere, Väinämöinen, the aged, the top of the dominance hierarchy, does something stupid and hits himself with an axe in the... Like, he'd already done a whole bunch of incredible tasks that are impossible for mere mortals. But then he's, all of a sudden he's got an axe in the knee. So we've said this in previous episodes, but it's a very well-known story of a hero traveling into the unknown and then not making it out quite whole, because traveling between the unknown and the known, the unconscious and the conscious, you often lose something in the transition. And so we're seeing Väinämöinen dealing with that injury that he has suffered in this transition, and he's bleeding a lot. And it makes me think we've been working with the idea that Väinämöinen is symbolic of the society and civilization. And this to me is when you have a very serious problem in the society that you can't just sort of fix with I would say by like throwing money at it. Like, it's a much deeper problem. And so we're going to try and figure out how he's going to solve this with the help of this old man who is now saying, what really is the root of this problem? And we're going to see what that is as we go on.
Definitely. And thank you for that deeper recap. They kind of dive right into this. And I half suspect that this was intended to originally you're supposed to read through it. It's like chapters in a book, really. It's not so much like, we've gone through the Poetic Edda and each poem is essentially self-contained. You can just start up and you get a whole new story each time. The Kalevala definitely has been really episodic so far. And so the last one basically completely transitioned into this episode here. And yeah, so Väinämöinen is going to go into this old man's house, and hopefully the old man can help him. And you're right in that this would have been like a grievous wound too. So Väinämöinen it's amazing that he's able to stand and able to move and things like that. The amount of blood they're talking about, of course they're hyperbolizing, like of course they're exaggerating the amount of blood for sure. But, Väinämöinen's like this supernatural guy and everything like that. So whatever. We'll just gloss over that a little bit. There's a lot of blood. That's the important thing here. And then I found it kind of interesting here. In the last poem, Väinämöinen also didn't know the words of the origin of iron. And here, this old man is asking about it. So I think this is a little bit curious. First of all, again, last time when we talked about it, it was the whole idea of, if you know the origin of iron, you know the origin of the thing that wounded you, something like that, you can do better to be able to fix that. And we'll get into that in a little bit of detail here. This is sort of a two-part story, and it's quite long. We actually didn't say that. This is a long poem. I don't know exactly how long it's going to end up being in terms of the length of the episode. We'll find out, of course. But there's just a lot of cool imagery, and there's two real sections here. So the origin of iron is the title of this poem, and we're going to talk about the origin of iron for a bit, but then the other side of it is also Väinämöinen getting cured and healed and everything. And so there's some cool stuff about Väinämöinen getting healed too. So this really just sets the stage for the rest of the poem, I think.
I think so too. Just one other thing that I wanted to mention, and we talked about it in the last episode, but I'll bring it up again because it's important. Nietzsche has that famous, God is dead and we have killed him and there's not enough water to wash away the blood. Väinämöinen here he's not dead, but he's definitely wounded. And he's probably not at the point where there isn't enough water to wash away the blood, but you can see why there wouldn't be enough water to wash away the blood. Like if you were to kill Väinämöinen, if this comes from a nasty, wound in his knee, imagine if he had died. And I think it really shows you the damage it does to a society, where how a society can't really continue to function if the ideal and the top of the dominance hierarchy, the thing that people should be aiming for, is destroyed. You leave a society in chaos. So we're getting a little taste of that here, where Väinämöinen is wounded, and we have all this blood. But imagine if he had been killed. Like that would, again, it would it would drown their world in a symbolic way. So
Yeah, good point as far as that particular bit of symbolism there. Should we move on with the poem here?
yes, let's go.
Okay. This will be a comparatively short section, lines 25 to 38. Back to the poem. Then the aged Väinämöinen answered in the words that follow. Well, I know the birth of iron and how steel was first created. Air is the primeval mother. Water is the eldest brother. Iron is the youngest brother, and fire in midst between them. Ukko, mightiest of creators, he, the god above in heaven, from the air the water parted, and the continents from water. When unborn was evil iron, uncreated, undeveloped.
So these few lines are actually very interesting, because we see something that we don't see in many other cultures, and that is air being represented as like a feminine aspect. It's usually male, and we actually do usually see water being separated from air. There comes a delineation between the two, but they have water as the eldest brother, so masculine. It's really flipped the script on sort of the normal, or maybe not normal, but most common way that these things are symbolized. But it's very interesting that we do still see the separation of water from air, and then the iron is the youngest brother, and the fire in the midst between them. The fire in between them, I think that's just the idea that if you're going to change elements and states, fire is often used because it creates a chemical change, and you can't turn it back. Once it's changed, and it's a good catalyst for that. And of course, to make steel, you would need fire. But it's interesting that we have associated evil with iron, and we talked a little bit about it before in the last episode, that iron is it's considered evil because it comes from the ground and like under the ground, so it's part of that unconscious chaos that because you don't know what's going to happen with it. And then of course when you think of iron, you can think of like iron skillets and building things out of iron, which are really great things that are awesome, make our lives better. But then there's also the weapons that are made out of iron, and just how crazy it was when they developed steel. And like the first culture that developed steel had a huge advantage over those who are still using copper, because steel can go through copper. Like you can't compare the two in terms of strength and durability. So it was amazingly strong, and just this huge improvement and advantage that a steel culture would have, or an Iron Age culture would have, over a Copper Age. And something that I read the other day that's interesting is that it's a little bit of an aside, but between the amount of time it took to go from like copper to steel, it took 4 times less time to go from steel to like nuclear weapons. To give you an idea of human development, but it shows you like what a jump iron and steel was after copper. And so you can see how people would consider it evil because they can't fight against it.
Definitely. And the cool thing, I think, about what you've mentioned and alluded to a couple of times here, in a couple of our previous Kalevala episodes, and in fact, the Runo 1 and Runo 2 episodes, we have seen foreshadowing of this very thing. First of all, there was the duck that laid the primeval eggs, and most of them were golden, but one was iron. And we got into some speculation in terms of that the iron is supposed to be kind of the evil element in the world. And yeah, that seems to be the case here. And just to clarify something as well, we're not reading ahead in the Kalevala so that we are as fresh on each individual poem as we can be. And we're not cross-referencing things that happen in the future in the episodes we're currently reading. So that's one reason why we weren't alluding to the future impact of iron coming from that first episode there. But the other thing that we touch on in Runo 2 was actually the development of the Copper Age as well. There was a little man of copper who developed, and they were unable to tame these large trees, like one large tree in particular. It took over like the entire world, the entire forest, which I think would just be an element of man doesn't really have control over the woods, the forest, nature in general, if he doesn't have tools that help to augment our powers. Like if humans only have our hands, right? If we only have our hands, we are basically chimpanzees. And a chimp is even stronger than a human. So, I mean, I think it's a whole different level, right? All the intermediate steps between a chimpanzee and a human. And of course, caveat, it's that we have a common ancestor with a chimpanzee. So don't jump on my back as far as that particular detail. It's a common ancestor. But all the steps between our common ancestor and today sort of thing, like we've gotten weaker in terms of physical strength, in terms of what we can do with our bodies. But the trade-off has been that we have gotten smarter and we have mastered tools. And stone would have been the original one. But I think stone is got to be inefficient compared to, say, copper. And so this man of copper emerges. He's got copper everything, and he cuts down this gigantic tree, right? And so this is all in Runo 2, which was a really cool episode on essentially human development of agriculture, a whole bunch of different things. But now here we're talking about the origin of iron, the onset of the Iron Age. And so I think this is just really cool, charting the path of human development through these early runos of Kalevala and seeing how the creation of the world and the development of all of these various stages of humanity made it into the mythology. And in the Norse mythology, we have a little bit less detail on that. So I find it really cool that here in the Kalevala, we have quite a lot of detail for those particular stories. The only other thing I'll touch on here as well, with the heir as being mother, I don't know for sure if this would have been a thematic consistency thing inserted by Elias Lundroth, the compiler of Kalevala, but heir as mother, that is almost definitely referring to Ilmatar, the original mother of Väinämöinen in the first Kalevala Runo. And her name essentially just means Lady of Air or Lady of the Sky. That's what her name means. But there's some speculation. I won't even say speculation. There's a couple of cases, other poems, other forms of creation poems that have some evidence that Ilmatar was not the original creator of the world and she was not even involved in the creation of the world sort of thing. So I could see some thematic consistency of saying that Air was the primeval mother, the original mother, inserted and changing this particular section if that was as is speculated. if the character of Ilmatar was created by Lunrot to better illustrate and tie some things together. If that was the case, then that would explain the heir as being the mother here. And then the whole elemental thing kind of cascades along with that. It's still a little interesting with water being the brother, water being the masculine element. That one is definitely the odd one out as far as symbolically the way things are, but that's just one explanation for it possibly. But going just on the text here, that's an interesting way to order the elements for sure.
Shall we move on to the next bit?
Let's do it. This is going to be lines 39 to 66. Back to the poem. Ukko, god of realms, supernal, rubbed his mighty hands together. Both his hands he rubbed together. On his left knee then he pressed them, and 3 maidens were created, 3 fair daughters of creation, mothers of the rust of iron, and of blue-mouthed steel, the fosterers. Strolled the maids with faltering footsteps on the borders of the cloudlets, and their full breasts were overflowing, and their nipples pained them sorely. Down on earth their milk ran over, from their breasts o'erflowing fullness. Milk on land and milk on marshes, milk upon the peaceful waters. Black milk from the first was flowing, from the eldest of the maidens. White milk issued from another, from the second of the maidens. Red milk by the third was yielded, by the youngest of the maidens. Where the black milk had been dropping, there was found the softest iron. Where the white milk had been flowing, there the hardest steel was fashioned. Where the red milk had been trickling, there was undeveloped iron.
So I think for most of the stories we do, this one has the most bodily fluids by volume. That's like weird blood, milk, like that's a lot of bodily fluids, at least by volume. I mean, not necessarily by variety. But we have this sort of crazy image of, the head god Ukko creating these maidens, and then they're spilling milk over the world. And this isn't like a far stretch for understanding the symbolism of that, but it's fertility. It's how things grow. Mother's milk is how you feed babies. There's no real secret here. What's interesting is the milk, the colors of the black milk, the white milk, and the red milk, and what it creates. And so the black milk creates this, softest iron, right? And like, what does that mean? Well, the softest iron is wrought iron, and you can make all sorts of things out of it. You can, but not really weapons. Like you wouldn't necessarily make weapons out of it, but fences or cauldrons. Like it's a very workable, very malleable type of iron. And then the second, the white milk, and also the one that you wouldn't really give your baby black milk, right? Like I don't think you'd assume bad things would happen from that. White milk, though, that's good stuff. And that's where you're getting steel, which is like the best form of iron. It's the thing that you can make the strongest, best things out of. And then the red milk, the undeveloped iron it's just known as pig iron, and that's the stuff. It's not great, but you can work it so that it'll get better. I don't know much about like forging and blacksmithing, but I think if you're able to take the carbon out by heating it and hammering it and heating it and hammering it and all that, you do purify it a bit, and you can get something stronger out of it than just your lump of pig iron that isn't that great. And so we see the mythological origin of iron here, and the different types, and what the different types do. So it's a cool little, I guess, piece of seeing like how they would put this out into the world and how they would explain the presence of iron, but also these different types of iron in the world.
Exactly. And I think that's the only takeaway here from this section for me, is that this is the way that they would have explained how it would have gotten there. And it makes sense, them having sort of these mothers who, with their fertility, they create this element that has so much potential, and it's relatively different from basically everything else that would have been usable at the time. So it's interesting, first of all, that they have this story, and the imagery, of course, is a little bit weird. And yeah, the black and red milk, I mean, I'm pretty sure that those aren't good signs if those are happening in real life. But in terms of the symbolic significance, having different colors for the different colors of iron, like that works, right? Like that wrought iron you were saying, like that, it's black, right? And then the white stuff, steel, like steel is a lot more clear. Like it's this gray silver thing. Like you can even just use steel to describe the color of it, this light gray. White, that makes sense as far as describing that. And then the red, I think that really just is the color of iron ore as well. I don't know a lot about the geology on this. I don't know if you can find forms of iron that aren't this red undeveloped iron. I don't know. I don't know if maybe there are places where you can find more pure, more developed forms of iron, even hardened steel sort of thing. I don't know. I don't know if that's possible, but I am relatively sure that the iron, the red ore, that is like the natural form that you would find almost everywhere.
For sure, that's why rust is red, right? Like that's sort of iron in its natural habitat being oxidized. So yeah.
Exactly. So again, I think this is just a pretty interesting story as far as the development in the different forms. And I think the different forms, if the one isn't natural, or sorry, if only the red is natural, the ore there, them also distinguishing between the two other types, they're also distinguishing by function. They're not distinguishing by the natural placement of these elements. They're distinguishing by the red is undeveloped, then the black, that's soft iron, and then white, that's hardened steel. Those would be different functions of iron that take different processes to reach them, and they have different functional uses. So this gets into a little bit of how we see objects based on their function as opposed to based on the object in of itself. That's an interesting concept that maybe takes a little bit to get around, but you see it in mythology, especially like the function of objects and symbols is more important than the literal form of the symbol, the form of the object itself, the form of what it actually does. It's what it does is the important thing. So I think that's what we're getting at this case.
I think you're right. And I think we actually see a good example of that a little later on in the poem as well. But yeah, no, that's a great point that, yeah, we see functions. Even that's sort of why like science was so revolutionary, was because we were looking at objects almost for their own sake. Like what's their own properties and things like that. And we hadn't really necessarily done that before. It was, how do we relate to it, and what does it do for us? Why do we care about it? Because if it's something that we can't use, and we can't interact with, we don't care about it because we don't need to. And there's enough going on that, we'd go insane if we had to worry about absolutely everything in our presence. So yeah, that's a great point to bring up.
Awesome. Shall we move on?
Yes.
Okay. This is going to be lines 67 to 106. Back to the poem. But a short time had passed over when the iron decided to visit him, its dearest elder brother, and to make the fire's acquaintance. But the fire arose in fury, blazing up in greatest anger. seeking to consume its victim, even the wretched iron, its brother. Then the iron sought for refuge and protection from the hands of furious fire. From his mouth, all bright with anger, then the iron took refuge from him, sought both refuge and protection down amid the quaking marshes, where the springs have many sources, on the level, mighty marshes, on the void and barren mountains, where the swans their eggs deposit, and the goose her brood is rearing. In the swamps lay hid the iron, stretched beneath the marshy surface, hid for 1 year and a second, for a 3rd year likewise hidden there between 2 tree stumps, 'neath 3 roots of birch trees hidden. But it had not yet found safety from the fierce hands of the fire, and a second time it wandered to the dwelling of the fire, that it should be forged to weapons and to sword blades should be fashioned. On the marshes, wolves were running. On the heath, the bears came trooping. 'Neath the wolves' feet quaked the marshes. 'Neath the bears, the heath was shaken. Thus was ore of iron uncovered, and the bars of steel were noticed, where the claws of wolves had trodden and the paws of bears had trampled.
So poor Iron here just wants to go meet his family, and that jerk Fire, it's coming after him and wants to burn him up, and Iron's like, whoa, 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 and then is trying to hide. And I think we're seeing an explanation for why we find iron deposits in these various places in the mountains and the marshes, that those areas. And because at the time they wouldn't have known why, but this is where they find iron. So, well, what's the reason? It's hiding from the fire. And why is it hiding from the fire? Well, it doesn't want to be forged into, it doesn't want to be burned, but also doesn't want to be forged into weapons and sword blades and all that. All of the, I guess we'd call it bad stuff that, spoiler alert, it will eventually be forged into. And I think we get a bit of foreshadowing with that, actually, when we see the bears and the wolves walking over its hiding spots in the marshes. Because with bears and wolves, they have their own. They're born with their own weapons. They've got claws and teeth that are perfect for hunting and killing. Humans, like you were mentioning earlier, we don't have that, so we have to use tools. And so iron is the sort of the best at the time, the best element to forge these tools out of. And then steel, of course, is even better for basically making our own teeth and claws. And in the marsh, you have marsh itself is a symbolic liminal place where you have land and water mixing in a weird way. There's no clear boundaries. It's a marginal space. And that's kind of what you have with iron, because we've got them talking about making weapons, but you also make a lot of very useful things out of iron. Even I'm just saying, horseshoes, those are incredibly important, and did a surprising amount for animal husbandry and human progress in the world. And that's not a inherently bad thing, like horseshoes, right? But then again, you add swords and weapons to it. You get knights, and you're able to fight wars with cavalry and things like that. So there's always that dichotomy where you have this great invention, but there's that dark side where you can find abuses of it and things that you didn't necessarily foresee when you were making your great invention, but it turns out to be a new problem that you have to solve.
Exactly. And I like your point about the bears and the wolves and stuff. Like, it's not nice animals that are trampling all over the marshes. Yeah, it's dangerous ones. And it's a good point that it's the danger, it's potential for added danger that iron eventually ends up being. Again, sort of spoiler alert, but that is the progression that we're going to look at. And it hiding away from fire, that's interesting. It's sort of like saying the iron is better off not being used. Like, it's one of those things, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? Like, once iron starts to get used, it becomes literally an escalation. Like, cultures that didn't have iron would have been dominated by cultures that did have it. And that was essentially the diffusion. It's pretty much, okay, it's speculated anyway. Well, more like, I don't know 100% the order of this technology developing, but my understanding is that the Germanics and the Balts had iron before the Finns and the Slavs, and so for a long time, those were the dominant cultures in the area, which is now the area of continental Europe where the Germanic cultures would have been kind of at their largest extent. They would have dominated those areas. But then once the Finns and the Balts the Finns and the Slavs and all that eventually started to get iron as well, then they spread out. And the area where Finnic cultures dominated for a very long time culturally was much larger than the area that, essentially Finland and Estonia are the only countries that have majority as being Finnic peoples. If I go to Finno-Ugric, then you have to include Hungary. But then there's the little pockets in Russia, all the way out to almost the Ural Mountains and the other side of the Ural Mountains, that have large minorities that speak languages that are related to Finnish and Estonian. And so that's the extent of where the Finnic culture was. But then they got dominated by other cultures that were more technologically advanced and more tribally advanced. I mean, they didn't have their own countries for the longest time. Hungary was a bit different, but Finland and Estonia didn't show up until 1917. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to see the way technology is such a determiner. And so leaving it in the ground is kind of one answer to, well, you could avoid a lot of conflict, right, if you didn't have this iron, this technology. But once you start to use a technology, it's really impossible to go back. We essentially have the same problem with oil these days. Like, there's a lot of reason to really think that the only way we're going to slow down climate change is if we stop producing oil. But then so many things are going to just end. Like, you won't have planes, you won't have shipping. Cars, maybe we can convert to electricity, but then we're going to look at how does that electricity get produced, sort of thing. And so it's hard. Like, modern society is where it is because of our use of oil, and just leaving it in the ground now, like, it's hard to do that. You have to give up essentially industrialized civilization to do that. And it would be the same problem here with iron at the time. And again, I'm not saying that climate change, it's not something that isn't a problem that we need to have solutions for, sort of thing. But leaving the oil in the ground is really not a viable solution, because it's impossible for us to do that without essentially going back to, say, the Middle Ages of the Iron Age, before oil was discovered and usable, right?
Well, no, that's just it. I mean, oils and everything. I'm wondering too if this, because you were saying that the Germanic tribes had steel first, and I think you can see that because I know the weapons that, like, the Vikings used were well feared because they were quite strong and used quite good iron and steel. I'm wondering too if this kind of explains why, like, the Germanic peoples had it first, and like why we Finnish people didn't. We didn't have it at the same time. Well, iron was hiding from us, right? So I'm just wondering if that sort of helps explain the difference in, I guess, in technological advancement. Although and I don't know this at all, but maybe there's a lot more iron in, you know, like mainland Germanic areas rather than in like the Finnic areas too. So I don't know, but I was wondering about that when I was reading it. Just maybe this is an explanation too for why, you know, the Germanic tribes had it first and why we didn't have it. Well, the iron was hiding from us.
Well, I would also think that the sources of iron sort of thing, like the marshes and stuff, like that basically is the landscape of Finland proper and the area just to the east. Like not necessarily just marshes, but lakes and stuff like that. Like it's one of those, I think it's a shield. That's what it is geologically. And in northern Canada, it's the same thing in kind of the Midwest, not northern Canada, like eastern Canada. It's the same thing. It's the Canadian shield is what it's called. And the landscape is very similar in terms of loads and loads of lakes sort of thing, like all over Midwestern US as well is similar. It's the same geographical feature, I believe. And so, yeah, I think that would have had geological implications to them finding it. And maybe a lot of it was like they stumbled upon these deposits in various places in marshes and things like that, which would make it less available than, say, finding a gigantic mine in some mountain or something like that. Which
Absolutely.
I think maybe it was just less available is kind of the thing, which is sort of a luck of the draw kind of thing. You these tribes, whatever, go out in all directions to find places to prosper. And maybe in a hunter-gathering or even an agriculture type lifestyle, they can do very well. But then it turns into, well, these guys have iron and we don't. And that turns into a whole struggle thing. And so the availability of iron might have been the issue here. And this is interesting in showing, well, what is most likely how iron would have been discovered by the Finnic peoples. So
shall we move on?
Let's do it. Sort of formal introduction to a character we've alluded to in the past. Back to the poem. Lines 107 to 122. Then was born smith Ilmarinen. Thus was born and thus was nurtured. Born upon a hill of charcoal, reared upon a plain of charcoal. In his hands a copper hammer, and his little pincers likewise. Ilmari was born at night time, and at day he built his smithy, sought a place to build his smithy where he could construct his bellows. In the swamp he found a land ridge, and a small place in the marshes. So he went to gaze upon it and examined the surroundings, and erected there his bellows and his anvil there constructed.
I absolutely love the idea that he was born at nighttime and at day he built a smithy. For me, it shows that, you know, ideas and creativity, they come from the nighttime, the unconscious, the dark. But then when you actually build it, you bring it into the daylight, right? And so using this here, I just love them. Like, that's exactly right. That you've got this god of creation, of smithing, and, you know, born at the nighttime. So he's literally taking like dreams and making them real. So I love that symbol. And then you just have him setting up his shop, you know, near the in the swamp, in the marshes where there's iron. So of course that's where you'd go, because your materials right there. It's also neat because, like, as I was saying before, marshes and swamps is kind of this liminal split space between. It's a mixture of land and water, and so it's kind of the same way that the smith is a liminal space between, like, idea and material, because you're taking your ideas and building them into real life. So there's just a whole bunch of sort of interesting marginal things going on here.
Yeah, it's an interesting passage. And again, the formal introduction of Ilmarinen, we've talked about him a little bit before in terms of what his name means, because Väinämöinen talked about him a couple of poems ago. But his name is interesting. It is based on the word for air, just like the word Ilmatar is based on air. It's the same root, Ilma. And Ilmarinen is essentially just an extension of the word for air. Like he was originally based on that, essentially a sky god. And there is some speculation that he was the original kind of head of the pantheon, even though that's not necessarily as important. We've talked to some people online who have mentioned that the significance of gods and things was maybe a little bit less in the Finnic peoples, and the ancestral cult and the bear cult would have been more important. That said, the character Ilmarinen was there, he would have had the role of some kind of a sky god. And then the idea is that when Baltics and Germanics, they introduced iron, or iron eventually came to be usable sort of thing, the god Ilmarinen became a god of smithing, and he became a god of this new fantastic technology that would have enabled significant advancement. So yeah, Ilmarinen, he's an interesting guy, but at the time of this story, he is now fully the smith god. It also shows the progression a little bit. The copper, right? He's using copper before formally finding iron. And born upon a hill of charcoal. Charcoal is also important for the process of refining iron into steel, so which we'll actually see a little bit here. So it all kind of makes sense. Like he's basically all set up to be the top blacksmith, the best blacksmith, the top of that particular dominance hierarchy.
And it's interesting too, because if Ilmarinen was the top god at one point, and he's the sky god, it actually puts what we saw at the beginning where they had the Sky Mother, it puts it back to its sort of most common structure, where you have a male or masculine deity as the sky god, and one who orders things. So I just thought that was interesting. But yeah, it's neat. You were mentioning the charcoal and copper. I love that too, that they went through that stuff and made sure that it was included. There's actually, like you're saying, we're going to see, there's actually like realistic instructions, or at least methods of smithing and making, iron into steel and stuff like that. And it's pretty impressive.
It is, definitely. Shall we move on and get into that? Okay. This will be lines 123 to 166. Back to the poem. Then he hastened to the wolf tracks, and the bear tracks also followed. And the ore of iron he saw there, and the lumps of steel he found there, in the wolf's enormous footprints, where the bear's paws left their imprints. Then he spoke the words which follow. O thou most unlucky iron, in an ill abode thou dwellest, in a very lowly station, 'neath the wolf prints in the marshes, and the imprints of the bear paws. Then he pondered and reflected. What would be the upshot of it, if I cast it in the fire, and I laid it on the anvil? Sore alarmed was hapless iron, sore alarmed and greatly startled, when of fire it heard him speaking of the furious fire. Said the smith, said Ilmarinen, but indeed it cannot happen. Fire his friends will never injure, nor will harm his dear relations. If you seek the fire's red chamber, all illumined with its brightness, you will greatly gain in beauty, and your splendor greatly increase. Fitted thus for men's keen sword blades, or as clasps for women's girdles. Therefore, when the day was ended, was the iron from out the marshes, delved from all the swampy places, carried homeward to the smithy. Then he cast it in the furnace, and he laid it on the anvil, blew a blast, and then a second, and he blew again a third time, till the iron was fully softened and the ore completely melted, like to wheaten dough in softness, soft as dough for rye bread kneaded in the furnace of the smithy, by the bright flame's softening power.
Poor Iron, spending all this time hiding from fire, and then Ilmarinen comes and just, nope, going in the fire. And yeah, you just worked so hard to hide and just gone like that. But Ilmarinen was right. Iron wasn't going to be destroyed by the fire. It was going to be purified and made into useful things, which is sort of not unlike humans, unfortunately, where we go through hardships and then come out better on the other side. We have to put ourselves into the fire and burn away the impurities, and then on the other side, you come out better. And rarely, well, not rarely, it actually happens more often than we'd like to admit. But I mean, we're not as lucky as Iron in that we probably aren't going to get damaged by the fire. I mean, usually we do get damaged by the fire, but something better comes out of it, and something harder and something more durable. So it's not all bad news, but we do have to go through the fire, and you can't hide from it, right? Like, you may not want to go through the hard stuff, but it's going to find you eventually. And I think that's an important lesson to see here, is that Iron was hiding, but the fire found him through literally an act of God, right? And that seems to be a pretty common thing in life, where the thing that you're hiding from will eventually come and find you, and then you have to deal with it on its terms rather than your terms if you had gone out to find it. And we see, Ilmarinen trying to sort of ease the anxiety of Iron, saying, "Oh, you'll be fitted thus for men's keen sword blades, whereas clasps for women's girdles." And that's kind of the dichotomy, right? Like, you're going to be made into swords, yes, but also clasp for women's girdles. That's more of a beauty and like a life-giving thing, right? Rather than a sword that's probably going to be used to kill people. I also like the instructions on how to basically use a bellows and make a fire hot enough to be able to soften the iron and make it like rye bread dough. Like, that's pretty cool. I'm really in this particular Runo, I'm really enjoying the mixture of sort of mythological explanations with the practical, like, this is actually how we make iron and work it.
Yeah, it's a good section here. And I think it's interesting as well how Ilmarinen, or by extension, whoever was discovering iron in the first place, figured out that if you put this in the fire, that you can actually get something useful from it. Like, all this stuff, it's sort of the development of humanity. A lot of it had to have been really trial and error. Like, what they found on the ground, like taking the leap from that, this kind of reddish ore thing, into, hey, what can I do with it? And then having the wherewithal to go and put it into a fire and control it and get it to a point of actually being usable as a metal that's useful for tools and for weapons. It's the dichotomy, as you said. It's just impressive to see the development of humanity. And then in this poem, it's just the accuracy of it, essentially. Like, I fully believe that this would have been how this would have worked as far as the creation of iron. Like, having this as the mythological explanation for it, it's also got a lot of accurate stuff, like the bellows you're saying. So, but the iron is not harmed and it becomes of use, which, going from the lowly station of not being used to the elevated station of having a use and a purpose. Yeah, on one hand, that's really very good, but the purpose is maybe a little naive in terms of only being used for women's girdles, and then the sword blades, of course, is mentioned, right? So we're going to see what ends up happening in terms of the use for tools and the use for harm and all that. But for now, iron is actually not completely getting a bad situation. Like he was hiding away from fire, but now maybe there's actually some use to come from that. So that's not so bad.
No, not at all. Shall we see what uses there are?
Let's do it. This will be lines 167 to 192. Back to the poem. Then exclaimed the iron unhappy, O thou smith, O Ilmarinen, take me quickly from this furnace, from the red flames that torment me. Said the smith, said Ilmarinen, if I take you from the furnace, perhaps you might become outrageous and commit some furious action. Perhaps you might attack your brother, and your mother's child might injure. Therefore swore the iron unhappy, by the oaths of all most solemn, by the forge and by the anvil, by the hammer and the mallet. And he said the words which follow, and expressed itself in this wise. Give me trees that I can bite them. Give me stones that I may break them. I will not assault my brother, nor my mother's child will injure. Better will be my existence, and my life will be more happy if I dwell among companions as the tools of handy craftsmen, than to wound my own relations and disgrace my own connections.
So iron here has accepted its fate, but Ilmarinen recognizes that there is danger here, right? That iron can be used to commit furious action and attack brother and mother and child and all that, all those people that you don't want to be attacked. And so iron says, no problem. I'll just, I'll cut down trees. I'll smash stones. Life will be easier for everyone using me. And, I'll be able to be used by handicraftsmen, and it'll be great. He's looking at all the positive aspects that iron bring to human life, and the ease that it brings to humanity in being used as a tool and being able to interact with the world. Now, we both know that, I guess we both, but everyone listening knows that eventually something's going to happen here to get iron from this amazing, wonderful thing into the weapons that kill people. We haven't seen it yet. We'll see it soon, but we're seeing that iron, at least at the beginning, had good intentions and wanted to do its best to be good for humanity.
Definitely, and I do see the naivety here of what iron would be used for, like seeing the tools, seeing the various functions of iron, but believing it's not going to be used to hurt or kill. Yeah, that's a little bit naive. That's some willful blindness right there, as far as seeing the potential of iron in the positives, but not in the negatives, or at least the negatives depending on who you talk to, because it can be a positive as far as being used as a tool of intimidation or defending against enemies who want to kill you, right? But then you add in human malice and you get a completely different result as far as the capability of new technology. And as you said before, like, we have gone so quickly in terms of technological development. We're basically at the point that if we were to try to use full modern weapons of war, we would destroy the entire world. And so warfare has to be waged with not our best technology. We can't use the best, most destructive technology we have for warfare, because that would destroy the entire world, or at least lead to a chain reaction of events. And I'm talking about nuclear weapons here. But even the other stuff that we have for warfare, like there's drones, there's guns that are so incredibly powerful. It's just crazy in terms of the level of technology being used to kill and destroy. And here, in an age where you didn't have iron and now you have iron, that drastically increases the capability of death and destruction. But iron is swearing it's not going to do that. So, pinky swear, I guess.
Yeah. No, I love your point about willful blindness because it absolutely is. It's taking Ilmarinen here is taking Iron's word that it'll only be used for this. But if you think about it, you know, give me trees that I can bite them, give me stones that I may break them. Trees and stones are generally more hardy than like human bodies, right? So if you can bite a tree or smash a stone, you can probably smash a human.
I would think so, yeah. Let's see where the consequences go, huh?
Let's do it.
This will be lines 193 to 230. Back to the poem. Then the smith, even Ilmarinen, here the great primeval craftsman, from the fire removed the iron, laid it down upon the anvil, welded it till it was wearied, shaped it into pointed weapons, into spears and into axes, into tools of all descriptions. Still there was a trifle wanting, and the soft iron still defective. For the tongue of iron had hissed not, and its mouth of steel was formed not. For the iron was not yet hardened, nor with water had been tempered. Then the smith, even Ilmarinen, pondered over what was needed, mixed a small supply of ashes, and some lye he added to it, to the blue steel's smelting mixture, for the tempering of the iron. With his tongue he tried the liquid, tasted it if it would please him, and he spoke the words which follow. Even yet it does not please me for the blue steel's smelting mixture and perfecting of the iron. From without, a bee came flying, blue-winged from the grassy hillocks, hovering forwards, hovering backwards, hovering all around the smithy. Then the smith spoke up as follows. O thou bee, my nimble comrade, honey on thy wings convey me, on thy tongue from out the forest, from the summits of 6 flowerets, and from 7 tall grass stems bring it, for the blue steel's smelting mixture, and the tempering of the iron.
All right. So we have Ilmarinen even going further into the willful blindness and actually crafting weapons out of the iron and thinking that it, or not thinking that it might be used maliciously. And as he's working the iron and using techniques that are actually quite accurate with ash and lye, I thought that was a cool addition. And we also have, blue steel. I think it was at this point where I chuckled to myself because of the movie Zoolander and the blue steel model look. But we have Ilmarinen, he sees a bee and asks the bee to bring him honey so that he can add it to the tempering solution for the iron. And it's kind of nice, like you're going to bring something sweet to it and good and wholesome and just like one of the best things ever, because honey was rare, but it was a treat. And, imagine like tempering your steel, with a solution that's got honey in it. It's joyful. It's happy. Nothing bad is going to happen, right? It's almost an image of paradise that you've got here where, the beautiful honeybee is going to bring you the honey and you're going to make these tools and everything's going to be wonderful. But we all know what happens when you have a paradise, right?
We all know what happens. And, well, it's interesting here that, first of all, the accuracy of all of this, like, I don't know how this was discovered, right? Like, mixing this stuff into the mixture for iron. Have you ever watched the show Forged in Fire? It's a lot of fun. It's a great show. It's like those cooking shows where they're all competing together, except it's making weapons. It's a lot of fun. They make a knife on the first day, and that's how they get it down to 2 competitors. It starts at 4 and they get it down to 2 competitors, but then they make like a legit weapon. They let them go home to their home forges and they make like a legit cool historical weapon, and it's a lot of fun. But they go through the whole process and what you need to do, and part of it is using steel that is of a certain level of hardness. They do interesting things with it, such as welding. Like that's something to get the steel to be of certain qualities. I don't know enough about it, but I've watched Forged in Fire, and it's a fun show. And it's accurate. And then the whole tempering with water too, like that's how steel gets hardened. That's usually the end step for all of the knife makers in the competition, is they put their steel into the water, and that's like the critical step. And isn't that interesting too? Like you put it into the water, and it's either going to harden the steel correctly, and I think it's something to do with the interplay of the temperature of the water and the temperature of the steel. And if you get it wrong, like if you make it so that it cools down too quickly, you can get it to, they say you hear like a ting noise or something like that, or a ping or whatever, and it's really, really not good, and it creates flaws in the steel. And so it's just interesting that water has the potential to either create this hardening or create a weapon that is significantly more weak and brittle and can be broken more easily. Like that's the symbolism of water right there.
Oh, it's amazing. And I've heard too, like I think too, you put most of the work into the item before you put it in the water. So like it's this make or break moment where it could all just like fall apart and it's ruined, and just over this one little thing of cooling it down like improperly. Like it's pretty dramatic actually. Like it's a good it's a good show, check it out. But also just that moment where they're gonna put in the water, like all your hard work, it's coming down to this one moment where it could just be ruined. Oh, terrible.
That's right. But them figuring this out, though, whoever figured this out originally, like, so good. Like, this would have been a trial and error process. This would have been like, how do you make this any better? And whoever thought of throwing in like ashes and lye, and I know charcoal is also used as well, but whoever figured that out, like, good job. You just brought humanity forward, like, a gigantic leap in technological capability, because steel is significantly better than iron that is not tempered into steel, as far as its hardness, its capability as a tool, as a weapon, as armor, all of these things. It's significantly better.
Absolutely. I mean, we are still using steel for most things, right? Like especially in like war, most of your items are going to be made out of steel, especially like armor for tanks, and you might get like titanium in there, but steel is still significantly used, even though we have the atomic weapons. But as you're saying before, you can't really use them because I don't think it's like during the Cold War, which we were both sort of too young for that, or not even born. So I didn't grow up with the fear of it because I didn't know about it really. Like mid to late 80s, and then the wall came down and everything was pretty okay. But there were a few times where, they had the term mutually assured destruction. Well, that wasn't just a catchy name. That was true. I remember I was reading the autobiography of Robert McNamara, who's like the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, I think. And I can't remember under whose like presidency it was under, but he basically went on the news and said, well, someone asked him like, oh, the Russians have claimed they have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 10 times over. And McNamara's like, oh yeah, well, we've got enough to destroy it 16 times over. And you're like, and then later the president was like, what are you talking about? Like, you can't say that. Like, that's not a thing to brag about. He's like, yeah, you're right. Sorry. I didn't know what to say. But that was the reality of it. Like, you could just wiping out the planet was not that far away. Like it was within in the realm of possibility. And yeah, I love your point too about like, how did this happen? How did someone discover this? I have no idea. Like in a million years, I wouldn't have thought of this. Like how does it happen? I don't know. Because I'm thinking, like, do you just start randomly burning things because it's fun?
That sounds pretty likely.
Maybe, yeah, right? Like, oh, grass. Okay, grass does that. Oh, I can cook food. Well, what else can I cook? I don't know, but it's wild that it happened.
Definitely. And I mean, that just shows human ingenuity, right? Like, even today, people are coming out with all these crazy ideas that turn into super important technologies that enrich our daily lives, right? And this would have enriched daily life. Like an axe made out of iron or steel would have been much better than an axe made out of copper as far as its durability. For sure, its durability, if nothing else, but also its ability to cut and to break and to just be used as a tool in general. But as we saw previously, an axe can also hit you in the leg and create torrents of blood. So, but, well, the iron said it wouldn't do that though, so I don't know how that happened.
Should we find out?
Let's find out. This will be lines 231 to 266. Back to the poem. But the hornet, bird of Hiisi, looked around him and he listened, gazing from beside the roof tree, looking from below the birch bark, at the tempering of the iron and the blue steel's smelting mixture. Thence he flew on whirring pinions, scattering all of Hiisi's terrors, brought the hissing of the serpents, and of snakes the dusky venom. And of ants he brought the acid, and of toads the hidden poison, that the steel might thus be poisoned in the tempering of the iron. Then the smith, ein Ilmarinen, he, the greatest of the craftsmen, was deluded and imagined that the bee returned already and had brought the honey needed, brought the honey that he wanted. And he spoke the words which follow. Here at last is what will please me, for the blue steel's smelting mixture and the tempering of the iron. Thereupon the steel he lifted. In he plunged the luckless iron. As from out the fire he took it, and he took it from the anvil. Then indeed the steel was angry, and the iron was seized with fury. And its oath the wretch has broken, like a dog has soiled its honor. Brutally its brother bitten, striking at its own relations. Let the blood rush forth in torrents, from the wound in torrents gushing.
Darn it. So you have this vision of this, honeybee bringing honey to finish the forging of iron, and it's this paradise. It's lovely. But then you get this hornet, this bird of Hiisi, and one of the translations I saw for this was devil bird, which I loved. Like, it's a great way to describe a hornet, really, because they're not friendly. It's funny, like you grow up and you think, you're kind of scared of bumblebees, and some kids are allergic, and you give them space, which is good. But then as you grow older, you kind of realize, like, they're not interested in you. They just want flowers. And you see a bee, and it's like, okay, yeah, the bee's doing its thing. I'm not smashing its hive. I'm probably okay. Hornets and wasps, though, they just go after you. They're jerks. Like, they go out of their way. Like, I don't know what their deal is, but they're jerks. And then you have one of these jerks come and spoil the forging of the iron with, just this great image of, like, the dusky venom of snakes and acid from ants and toads with hidden poison. And the other thing too is, like, why would Ilmarinen let the wasp or the hornet do it? Because they look like bees, like a little bit of willful blindness, but also kind of that, maybe like the happy-go-lucky, like, oh, I'm building this wonderful thing and everything's good. And it's very true. Like, if you're in a good mood and you're happy, like, you're kind of stupid because you're not looking for threats anymore. At least is not as carefully as you should be. You're because you're feeling good, right? Like if you're feeling bad, or if you're anxious, you're hyper aware. If you're feeling great, you're not really aware of your surroundings. And I kind of get that idea that like Ilmarinen thought like he's building this amazing thing, it's gonna be wonderful, and then this hornet sneaks in and puts in all of this venom, all of the bad things in life. And then when the steel comes out, it's angry and seized with fury and, like a dog that has soiled its honor, just ready to take on the world and has a bad attitude.
That's a good way of describing it. Definitely good way of describing it. And yeah, it's the natural progression, right? Like it's going to be used for weaponry. That's just the way it is. It's not that iron is only good as a tool. And again, it's like maybe the intention of it originally, the original intention of iron was to use it as a tool to improve life, improve work, all of these things. But it just follows that iron can be used to kill people, wound, hurt. And it's even just the case of like these tools, they're dangerous too. Like Väinämöinen was just working with his axe, right? And then he became wounded by it hitting him, like a workplace injury. Like you're not dealing with something harmless, right? When you're using these higher levels of technology, you need to know how to use it. And Väinämöinen in that particular case was careless, but also he blamed it on the iron being malicious towards him, like the iron striking out in error to wound him, right? And that's important too. Like if that's the way that people saw it, like first of all, it takes the agency away from the human, which maybe is a little bit comforting. But no. It's the human who's in charge of the tool that is the one who needs to use it properly. And Väinämöinen didn't. Maybe Väinämöinen was using it properly right up until the instant that he wasn't, but then he wasn't. And that's because it takes only a second for an accident or an injury or even a death to occur in terms of a workplace thing. But then as a weapon, like that's just on a whole different level. Even if you're using it properly, like you're intending to kill or injure. And that's just significant as well right there. So iron has the capability and the potential for all this good stuff, for making it easier to craft and to build and to work. But it's also got the potential for negatives and the potential for dire consequences if used improperly, or even if used properly, if what you want to do is use it as a weapon.
For sure. It's kind of this very obvious dichotomy between the two, because at least with humans, we're not these cuddly creatures, right? Like we generally like to fight, and with iron we have we can build these great tools for fighting. And I think I'm just now recognizing the amount of willful blindness. Like Ilmarinen here had to be incredibly willfully blind to not see that iron would become weapons. Like it's not even like an abuse of iron. It's at this point it's just one of the proper uses of it, right? It was making me think of Game of Thrones. Here's a Game of Thrones reference with the what is it, the iron price of something and the gold price, and like, and I'm also thinking of the all of the phrases we have surrounding like steel and iron that have to do with war, like tasting cold steel. I remember that was like one of the famous quips from like cartoons or whatever. It's like taste my cold steel, and then they'd have a sword fight. It's just part of our everyday thing where we recognize that steel and iron as part of war. Were a great book by Ernst Junger called Storm of Steel about World War One. We still have it today, where we associate steel and iron with weapons.
Exactly. It's ubiquitous in the culture, and it does increase the depth of the blindness that would have been. But at the same time, it's also like, well, we want these tools, right? We want iron for these purposes. Let's just all agree not to hurt anyone or whatever. And then when iron does hurt someone in the course of just using it, like for an axe or something like that, oh, blame the iron. It's interesting.
It is.
But it's not what we would advocate as far as taking responsibility for one's actions and being careful and safe.
This makes me think of robots and how terrifying that will be. I mean, they're already terrifying. You watch some of those things run and jump and open doors, but I hope that it doesn't go all Skynet on us and Terminator and the Matrix. It might, but I don't know, man.
Yeah, they're basically these steel creatures. Like they can, or probably some even more durable, lightweight, crazy form of metal sort of thing. And that's more durable than a human for sure. We're a bit more squishy.
A lot more squishy.
And shall we return to our squishy hero who is being tended to by the old man?
Yes.
That was the end of the retelling of the origin of iron. And now we're going back to Väinämöinen and the old man together. And the old man is going to take care of him, especially now that he knows the origin of iron. This will be lines 267 to 342. Back to the poem. From the stove, the old man mumbled, shook his beard, his head he nodded. Now I know whence comes the iron and of steel, the evil customs. O thou most unhappy iron, wretched iron slag most worthless. Steel thou art of evil witchcraft, thou hast been for naught developed, but to turn to evil courses in the greatness of thy power. Once thou wast devoid of greatness, neither wast thou great nor little, neither noted for thy beauty nor remarkable for evil, when as milk thou wast created, when the sweet milk trickled over from the breasts of youthful maidens, from the maidens' swelling bosoms, on the borders of the cloudland, neath the broad expanse of heaven. Thou wast then devoid of greatness, thou wast neither great nor little, when thou in the mud was resting, sunk below the sparkling water, overspreading all the marshland at the base of rocky mountains. And in loose earth thou wast altered, and to iron ore converted. Thou wast still devoid of greatness, thou wast neither great nor little, when the elks were trampling o'er thee, and the reindeer in the marshes, when the wolf's claws trod upon thee, and the bear's paws passed above thee. Thou wast still devoid of greatness, thou wast neither great nor little, when thou from the marsh wast gathered, from the ground with care uplifted, carried thence into the smithy to the forge of Ilmarinen. Thou wast still devoid of greatness, thou wast neither great nor little, when as ore thou there wast hissing, plunged amid the boiling water, or amid the fiery furnace, when the mighty oath thou sworest, by the forge and by the anvil, by the hammer and the mallet, where the smith himself was standing on the flooring of the smithy. Now that thou hast grown to greatness, thou hast wrought thyself to frenzy, and thy mighty oath hast broken. Like a dog hast soiled thy honor, for thy kinsman thou hast wounded, raised thy mouth against thy kinsman. Who has led thee to this outrage, to this wickedness incited? Perhaps thy father or thy mother, or the eldest of thy brothers, or the youngest of thy sisters, or some other near relation? Not thy father, not thy mother, nor the eldest of thy brothers, nor the youngest of thy sisters, nor some other near relation. Thou thyself hast wrought the evil and hast done a deadly outrage. Come thyself to see the mischief and to remedy the evil. Come, before I tell thy mother and complain unto thy parents. More will be thy mother's troubles, great the anguish of thy parents, that their son has wrought this evil, that their son had wrought this folly.
Well, Iron certainly gets it in this passage here. The image of the elks and reindeer trampling over the marshes with the wolves' claws and the bear's paws over it, I think is a great image. We talked a little bit about it before, that, wolves and bears, they come with their own weapons, but elk and reindeer are actually like a food source and a sign of great wealth for any of the Finnic tribes. It'd be like having cattle, right? And you have that dichotomy. You've got these animals that are dangerous to humans, but then you've got these animals that are also they would make you wealthy if you had a good herd. And it just shows you like the paths that Iron can take. It can go one way and make you wealthy, make your life great, or the other way, and it's harder and full of violence. So I love that imagery. It's interesting that they blame Iron for its sort of bad attitude. Like they blame itself and not Ilmarinen for sort of carelessly letting the hornet add the mixture of terrible things. But it kind of shows you this idea that like there's always that serpent in the garden, right? Like you can't have a perfect place. There's always going to be that little touch of chaos and sort of malicious intent somewhere, and it may not ruin everything, but it's definitely there, and you have to contend with it. And so Iron is kind of that representation of that maliciousness, because it is there and can be used to, attack father and mother and all that kind of stuff. So it's really interesting just to see the way they blame Iron, and you can almost see Iron as like the apple in the Garden of Eden, where it shows it puts on full display all of the knowledge, right, between good and evil, and how it would take you out of your unconscious nature, because now you have this thing that's too dangerous to be unconscious around.
For sure. And I think it also points to the function of Iron as well as the literal attributes of it. The whole snake in the garden thing, that's always a fun symbol to explore. But I think the other layer to this is that it's the attribute of Iron is that it functions as this evil thing if it's used improperly. So that becomes an attribute of the Iron itself, part of its function. Then it becomes the personification of the Iron. There's a lot of personification in here, right? The Iron as kind of a character. And so if the Iron is capable of all these good things, but it's also capable of evil, then sure, it makes sense to go kind of take that leap there, as far as the Iron is the one actually to blame for this. If it weren't for the Iron in the first place, then you wouldn't have any you wouldn't have any injury or death or anything like that from it. So the evil part of Iron must be part of its character. I can see that symbolic leap being taken, and maybe possibly as well how some of that personification makes sense, because you relate it to the way a person is in terms of the symbolism, and it just helps to make sense. That all is something that I think is plausible here. And then I like that it's kind of funny that he basically the old man recaps the entire story, but then he brings it into sort of this interesting, almost like a spell here. And now he understands that iron is the one that caused it, and iron is this evil force in terms of their origin story. And I guess the idea would be that he's got a better idea of how to treat it. And he even comes and tells the iron to maybe remedy the situation, but I'm not sure that iron is going to be able to do that. Iron isn't really the solution to the problems that iron causes.
No, definitely not. And it's interesting to see too this dichotomy of iron. It's very similar to Jung's idea of the shadow, right? That you have the conscious part of iron being the thing that builds all the great things, and then the unconscious part being the part that would build the weapons. And it isn't until you make the unconscious part conscious that you would see that potential, but also be able to use the iron properly. Because we've been talking about iron making weapons and killing people. The reality is sometimes you need weapons and have to kill people, like we're talking about, like for defense or whatever. Like, so, but you're using it consciously then, right? You know what it's for. You respect it. It's being used properly in all of its functions. But but what we're seeing here is that it was sort of unconscious. They made it, and it was the idea of the weapons were sort of this in the shadow, right? Like, it was, people were unconscious to that possibility, and then when it came out, it was like, oh wow, this is a huge thing that they didn't see coming. And it's maybe that's another reason why they're blaming the iron, is that because it has that unconscious part that it's not, because it hasn't integrated its shadow. It is in the wrong. Just like, if people act violently without reason, we look at that and say, oh, they're in the wrong. And it's not that they shouldn't act violent ever, because sometimes violence is necessary. It's just that it wasn't done consciously and with purpose. They were lashing out or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that describes the situation. And in terms of an accident, the lashing out unintentionally sort of makes sense, because Väinämöinen was using the iron for a specific purpose, and then it ended up jumping from its purpose to something that grievously wounded him. And so those explanations all definitely make sense. Shall we see how the healing process is going to go?
I think so.
This will be lines 343 to 416. Back to the poem. Hear me, blood, and cease thy flowing. O thou bloodstream, rush no longer, nor upon my head spurt further, nor upon my breast down trickle. Like a wall, O blood, arrest thee. Like a fence, O bloodstream, stand thou. As a flag in lakelet standing, like a reed in moss-grown country. Like the bank that bounds the cornfield, like a rock in raging torrent. But thy own sense ought to teach thee how that thou shouldst run more smoothly. In the flesh shouldst thou be moving, with thy current smoothly flowing. In the body it is better, underneath the skin more lovely. Through the veins to trace thy pathway, with thy current smoothly flowing. Then upon the earth rush downward, and among the dust to trickle. Flow not milk upon the flooring, soil thou not, O blood, the meadows, nor the grass, O crown of manhood, nor the hillocks gold of heroes. In the heart should be thy dwelling, and among the lungs dark cellars. Thither then withdraw thou quickly, there withdraw upon the instant. Do not issue like a river, nor as pond extend thy billows. Trickling forth from out the marshes, nor to leak like boats when damaged. Therefore, dear one, cease thy flowing. Crimson blood drip down no longer, not impeded, but contented. Dry were once the falls of Tyria, likewise Tuonela's dread river. Dry the lake, and dry the heaven, in the mighty droughts of summer, in the evil times of bushfires. If thou wilt not yet obey me, still I know another method, and resort to fresh enchantments, and I call for Hisi's cauldron, and will boil the blood within it, all the blood that forth has issued, so that not a drop escapes me, that the red blood flows no longer, nor the blood to earth drops downward, and the blood no more may issue. But if manly strength has failed me, nor is Ukko's son a hero, who can stop the inundation, stem the swift arterial torrent, thou, our Father in the heavens, Jumala, the clouds who rulest, thou hast manly strength sufficient, thou thyself the mighty hero, who shall close the blood's wide gateway and shall stem the blood escaping. Ukko, O thou great creator, Jumala, aloft in heaven, hither come where thou art needed, hither come where we implore thee. Press thy mighty hands upon it, press thy mighty thumbs upon it, and the painful wound close firmly, and the door whence comes the evil. Spread the tender leaves upon it, leaves of golden water lily, thus to close the path of bleeding, and to stem the rushing torrent, that upon my beard it spurts not, nor upon my rags may trickle.
I love this part because it's showing some magic, right? Like in this day and age, we wouldn't necessarily try and boil a cauldron of all the blood we had lost in a wound, right? Like it wouldn't necessarily do anything. But what we're seeing here are these methods with which they're going to try and heal Väinämöinen. And I was looking at this kind of from going back to using Väinämöinen as a symbol for civilization. They're using increasing methods of, I guess, let's say difficulty to heal him. You know, they're going to try and do it themselves. One, just by ordering it to stop bleeding, but then using a bit of magic. But then ultimately they appeal to Ukko, who is the great god, sort of the god of all. And it's kind of like, in order to restore Väinämöinen's health, they have to redirect themselves to the absolute highest good that they can perceive of, which is Ukko. And so then they ask, Ukko to press mighty thumbs upon it and close the painful wound and stop the bleeding and all that. And that's generally how people heal. It is by realigning themselves with the greatest good that they can conceive of. Even like if you think of people like in hard times just praying, I mean, that's what they're doing as well. They're trying to align themselves so that they get through the hardship at that moment. And the way you do that is by you just focus on the greatest good that you can conceive of and head towards it. And it's a little easier when like when you're in a tough situation, because the obvious answer is like not being in that tough situation anymore. But if we're looking at Väinämöinen as like society, that then it becomes a lot trickier, and you have to do some crazy magic and stuff, because there's a lot of moving parts to society. If a society is gravely wounded, it's not aiming at the highest good is great, but there's other. You're going to have to do more than just aim at it. You're actually going to have to progress towards it, and there's more intricacy to that than sort of as the system gets larger, it gets more complicated to do it. But the idea remains the same. You aim at the highest good that you can conceive of.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the thing about it is that they appeal to Ukko, to Jumala, in the most correct method that they get to, which is putting hands on it. Like compressing a wound is like the main way to do it. And again, this is one of those other areas I'm not an expert in. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a paramedic or anything, but I do understand that that's one of those things you do if you have like a cut or a wound or something. Like pressure on it instantly is one of the best ways to help it start to clot and things like that, and at least stem the bleeding. It's not necessarily going to heal anything that might be wrong internally, something like that, but it is the way to get the blood to stop. It's the best way that we've got. And so, yeah, they go from ordering it to stop to maybe doing some magic in a cauldron, which is, pretty cool. And I suppose one of those things where it's like, hey, if we boil it, maybe that'll get it to stop. Like, hey, why not? That's that trial and error thing again, right? But then they get to something pretty much correct. And I find it interesting. I don't necessarily know if they would have kind of put this appeal to Ukko in there afterwards, after the understanding of it, but it would make sense to me if somehow it's like, okay, so here's the correct way to do it. And then, therefore, if we're trying to apply it, appeal to God to make it work the best. Now, this one absolutely smells of Christian influence here, whether that was put in by Lundrod himself or it was present in the original source material. They were starting to become Christianized sort of thing, but I do suspect it was Lundrod who would have put this in. This is very much a Christianity-based thing. They do put it with Ukko, but as we mentioned, it's sort of like they didn't really have like this top all-father type god, this almighty god, the creator. Like Väinämöinen was involved in creation and Ilmatar and all that kind of originally in the first poems, but now he's like the creator god, god of all this sort of thing. And Jumala is the word that they use for God. That is the Finnish word for God. So as in the Christian God, the one God. So that's definitely something here, but the symbolic understanding of it, of aiming for the highest good, that's still worthwhile and valuable. Just because they've got some Christian imagery in there doesn't mean you have to throw out what the symbolism refers to.
No, exactly. One thing I just thought of with the boiling of the blood, there is sort of this idea in a lot of, let's say, esoteric traditions where, and there's like a technical term for it that I can't remember, but it's basically the idea that if, let's say, you wanted to cast a magic spell with water or something, you would use water in the casting of the spell, like a cup of water, because the cup of water is very similar to, let's say you wanted rain. It's very like you've got water here, and that will magically connect to the water in the sky. So using items that are very similar is a pretty well-known tradition in those types of, I guess, traditions. So that might be why you'd boil the blood, is it would it would definitely like solidify as you're boiling. It would probably be pretty gross, but that might be the way to like stop it from flowing. So I don't know.
That's a good point. Definitely a great progression along the trial and error of figuring out how to heal people, which
Absolutely.
is one of those things that just, I mean, until figuring that stuff out, lots of people are just going to die if they have an axe wound or they have an illness or something like that. The advent of medicine, before that, there was a lot of just trial and error and terrible practices that definitely did not work until we figured them out for real with the advent of science. But all this stuff that happens before that, it's best efforts, right?
For sure. And that's what I've been thinking about this throughout this poem, is that, like, back in the day, if you got cut, like, and it didn't have to be a big one, getting an infection and dying wasn't that weird. Like, it wouldn't be that hard to get, right? And then you just think, like, how often do you cut yourself just doing stupid things, and you wash your hands, and like, that's, you're okay. It doesn't get infected. You don't die. But back in the day, this was a real concern. And it wasn't even that long ago. I know if you look at some of the medical practices just in like the late 1800s, they're terrifying, right? And chances are, like, there are a good chance that you were going to die anyway. Like, again, I think one of the things in this poem that is really being driven into me is like how crazy it is and how smart people had to be able to figure this out, that they could go through all the trial and error on a whole bunch of different things and get us to where we are today. Like, that's nuts.
Exactly. It's the progression of human history for sure. But before we have all these advancements in modern technology, I mean, life would have definitely been rough. So it's interesting to see in this poem a description of kind of how that would work. So now that they appear to be getting the blood to stop, shall we see where they go from there? Because we're not done. Yeah.
Nope.
Okay, this is going to be lines 417 to 488. Back to the poem. Thus he closed the bleeding opening, stemming thus the bloody torrent, sent his son into the smithy to prepare a healing ointment, from the blades of magic grasses, from the 1,000-headed yarrow, and from dripping mountain honey, falling down in drops of sweetness. Then the boy went to the smithy to prepare the healing ointment. On the way he passed an oak tree, and he stopped and asked the oak tree, "Have you honey on your branches and beneath your bark sweet honey?" And the oak tree gave him answer, "Yesterday throughout the evening dripped the honey on my branches. On my summit splashed the honey, from the clouds dropped down the honey, from the scattered clouds distilling." Then he took the slender oak twigs from the tree, the broken fragments, took the best among the grasses, gathered many kinds of herbage, herbs one sees not in this country. Such were mostly what he gathered. Then he placed them o'er the furnace, and the mixture brought to boiling, both the bark from off the oak tree and the finest of the grasses. Thus the pot was boiling fiercely. 3 long nights he kept it boiling, and for 3 days of the springtime, while he watched the ointment closely, if the salve was fit for using and the magic ointment ready. But the salve was still unfinished, nor the magic ointment ready. Grasses to the mass he added herbs of many species, which were brought from other places, gathered on 100 pathways. These were culled by 9 magicians, and by 8 wise seers discovered. Then for 3 nights more he boiled it, and for 9 nights in succession, took the pot from off the furnace, and the salve with care examined, if the salve was fit for using and the magic ointment ready. Here there grew a branching aspen on the borders of the cornfield, and in twain he broke the aspen, and the tree completely severed. With the magic salve he smeared it, carefully the ointment tested, and he spoke the words which follow. As I with this magic ointment smear the injured crown all over, let no harm be left upon it. Let the aspen stand uninjured, even as it stood aforetime. Then at once was healed the aspen, even as it stood aforetime, and its crown was far more lovely, and the trunk below was healthy. Then again he took the ointment, and the salve again he tested on, and on broken stones he tried it, and on shattered rocks he rubbed it. And the stone with stone knit firmly, and the cracks were fixed together.
This is an incredible display of like trial and error and like testing out a hypothesis, and you've got, your magical ointment, but instead of trying to do it right on Väinämöinen and his knee, they're testing it out on things before, just to make sure nothing bad will happen and that it does what it says it's going to do. And again, that is human development right there, is testing out ideas and getting to a point where you can test out ideas, maybe not on humans right away. Now, I'm not going to say I recommend testing them on cute little animals or whatever, but it is a good idea to make sure that what you're making isn't going to kill people rather than do what you want, right? Like, you have to, there's a reason why there's an FDA and I don't know what it is in Canada, actually. It's something similar, but yeah, you don't want your new invention and medicine to kill your patient. So you have to make sure that it's going to work.
Exactly. And the whole trial and error thing too is interesting because he seems like he's adding more grasses and herbs and everything like that. But the thing about it is that pre-scientific cultures actually had a pretty darn good understanding of what various herbs and grasses and flowers and things like that actually did. They had a great idea of those properties. They understood which ones were poisonous, probably from someone dying, unfortunately, but the ones that did have some beneficial things. But the thing is, that's got to be tested over masses of people. Like, even just to get that folk wisdom of this particular plant or herb has some sort of benefit. And if you put it on a wound or something like that, like it's actually going to help it heal. It boggles the mind to think how long that would have taken to understand that and the cultural knowledge there. And now we understand that a lot of these herbs actually do have some great properties. We tend to do it a bit differently with medicines, but many herbs and spices and things like that, and grasses and whatnot, flowers, are still beneficial in some way, shape, or form. It's just not the same thing as modern medicine where it's proven and understood. But sometimes a natural solution is even better than like a drug or something like that, and works better with the body and things like that. So it is interesting, and this would have been the process. Now it certainly gets a little bit supernatural and magical in terms of how it works on, say, trees and stones as well. And if it works on trees and stones, it's got to work on a human, something like that. That's a bit different. That sounds something like putting Gorilla Glue on your wound or something like that. And I guess it's interesting. Like, I think you can put crazy glue or something on on a cut, and that's not a bad temporary thing to kind of keep it there. So it's not like that. That's not where I was going, though. I was going with something that could work for a stone or a tree or something like that would also work on a human. That's a leap. But I think on some level that if pre-science something can heal, that's pretty magical, honestly. So I can see why they would have a kind of magical explanation for it.
Oh, definitely. It's definitely magical. Yeah, the person who has the knowledge of what herbs to get and what to do with a wound, yeah, that would be absolutely considered, magic. And just for the crazy glue, that it was developed during the Vietnam War as a first aid method for wounds, and then they, I guess, realized they could use it for putting other stuff together other than people. But yeah, but it's another good example of trial and error and just sort of human ingenuity, right? It's very similar to what we're seeing in this poem, that we just kind of figured this out and don't know how. In some ways, that's magic too, right? We don't know why. I'm almost more comfortable with the idea that I don't know, aliens or a god came down and taught humans all of these crazy things to do, like the internal combustion engine. How did that happen? No idea. And to think that there are people smart enough to I don't know, they would have seen a concept over here and a technology over here, and then combined it and said, "Hey, this is great." That to me is almost more frightening than a supernatural reason. At least that I can wrap my head around. I don't have to think about it, or don't have to think about how I can't do that. Right? Anyone can get visited by aliens and taught to how to build a pyramid. But if people actually did it, crap, that's crazy.
And the funny thing is, it's the things that don't have writing to back up how they were created, right? Because a lot of modern technology, well, virtually all modern technology, it's backed up how it works and how it was created and invented and things like that. But this poem is the writing for how we figured out how to heal people before science. This is the remnants, right? It's not like here is this plant and it does this thing. I think there are actually old books that do go into that, but it's still not like a scientific approach to how technologies were developed, and everything getting society up to a certain level. It's almost a mystery how technologies developed. Like archaeologically, we can say, yeah, this technology developed at around this time and these sorts of things started to happen then, but we don't have records of how these technologies got put together. And so putting them into a mythological poem, yeah, that makes a lot of sense in terms of transmitting those sorts of knowledges, right? So
Shall we continue?
yeah, we're just about to finish it off. We're looking at Väinämöinen maybe getting some of this healing ointment. So this will be lines 489 to 546. Back to the poem. From the forge the boy came homeward, when the salve was fit for using. With the ointment quite perfected, in the old man's hands he placed it. Here I bring a perfect ointment, and the magic salve is ready. It could fuse the hills together in a single rock, unite them. With his tongue the old man tried it. With his mouth the liquid tasted, and the ointment tasted perfect and the salve was most efficient. This he smeared on Väinämöinen, and with this he healed the sufferer, stroked him downward, stroked him upward, rubbed him also on the middle, and he spoke the words which follow, and expressed himself in this wise. 'Tis not I who use my muscles, but 'tis the Creator moves them. With my own strength do not labor, but with strength from the Almighty. With my mouth I speak not to you. Jumala's own mouth speaks with you. If my speech is sweet unto you, Jumala's own speech is sweeter. Even if my hands are lovely, the Creator's hands are fairer. When the salve was rubbed upon him, and the healing ointment touched him, almost fainting with the anguish, Väinämöinen writhed and struggled, turning this way, turning that way, seeking ease but never finding. Then the old man banned the suffering. Far away he drove the anguish to the central hill of tortures, to the topmost mount of suffering, there to fill the stones with anguish and the slabs of rock to torture. Then he took a silken fabric and in strips he quickly cut it. From the edge he tore the fragments and at once he formed a bandage. Then he took the silken bandage and with utmost care he wound it. Round the knees he wound it deftly, round the toes of Väinämöinen. Then he spoke the words which follow and expressed himself in this wise. Thus I use God's silken bandage, the Creator's mantle wind I round the great knees of the patient, round the toes of one most noble. Watch thou, Jumala, most gracious, give thy aid, O great Creator, that we fail not in misfortune, that no evil may overtake us.
So I think it's safe to say we have another bit of the poem that is heavily influenced by Christianity. And actually, I've been noticing some lines that they sound like exactly like a lot of the lines in the Lord's Prayer. There's one back a bit that was like, "Thou our Father in the heavens." I mean, that sounds a lot like "Our Father who art in heaven," and some of the lines in here too. In this particular one, I thought, okay, that sounds a lot like, deliver us from evil and all that kind of stuff. So I think the Christian influence is quite present here. which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't think it actually changes the symbolic nature of it too much, because you're looking at someone who's done this pretty incredible thing. They're healing Väinämöinen, but at the same time, they're still making sure that they aren't becoming the greatest good that they can conceive of. There's still that target for them to aim for. But also, there's a fair amount of gratitude here, and I think that's something that maybe, especially in our modern age, we don't have enough of it. In that, like, we're literally living in an age that is like the best, easiest time to be alive, and and we're still like drastically unhappy. And one of the reasons I might suggest it'd be worth looking into. I'm not saying this is the reason, but we have a very materialistic view of the world, that there isn't anything greater than us, and it becomes very hard to aim at the highest good when, that's an abstract concept, that if there isn't a material item there that represents the highest good, then it doesn't matter, it doesn't exist. So, and I think that's why you see a lot of people going after money and using money to measure their own value, right? But here you have them, you do have that material aspect where they're physically healing Väinämöinen and making sure he's good to go in his physical body in the material world, but they're still looking up at the greatest good and still aiming for it, and thanking their journey to the greatest good for the benefits that it has brought them. And I think there's definitely a lesson there for all of us on a personal level, but also on a societal level. Like, there's a lot of talk about like overthrowing the various structures that have given us the society that we have today. And it's like, well, instead of like overthrowing everything, because things are really good right now, like maybe tweaking it, sure, like it can always be tweaked, but let's not overthrow it. Like, we don't want to go back to boiling blood to heal people's wounds. Like, we have good stuff that will take care of you. And can it get better? Absolutely. But it can also get a lot worse. So
Exactly. And again, here they put the appeal to the god in the places where they're doing stuff that actually works, like putting some kind of healing ointment on somebody, which I don't know if it's something like to fight infection or to better provide like maybe clean or whatever. I doubt that the people doing that would have understood exactly why it worked, but they figured out it worked eventually, sort of thing. So that's pretty good. And then a bandage, right? Like, that's, of course, the way to keep everything contained until it heals completely, right? And yeah, so they thank God in those particular instances. And again, of course, that's the Christian influence on at least the imagery, but I like that idea as far as it's the gratitude, and it's something that is greater than them as individuals and as the things that they do as individuals. Like, it's something that transcends what any one person can do. Like, every doctor is valuable and very good, but it's medicine, which is like kind of the overarching thing above, that enables society to prevent people from dying from all of these everyday ailments, sort of thing. And so that's, if you want to take away the Christianity out of it, sort of thing, maybe it's like an appeal to the force that causes these things to work, which now we understand it top to bottom, but back then they wouldn't have. So it works for them to appeal to that greater purpose, which would be this great good thing that they don't understand completely.
absolutely, there's actually a fairly recent example of that. I was just thinking, during the American Civil War, there's this phenomenon called the angel's glow. And what would happen is you would see at night wounded soldiers, their wounds would glow. And if their wounds were glowing, they usually survived and made a recovery. And if their wounds didn't glow, then they would die. And they called it angel's glow because they didn't know what it was. And it turned out, I think it's like a fungus, and it would eat the like the dead decaying flesh and stuff like that. So, and keep the wound clean, which is amazing. Like that's like the number one cause of dying pretty much from a wound. And they called it angel's glow, and would thank God for that, because obviously the highest good for someone who's wounded is to be healed. And why wouldn't you attribute that to the highest good, right? So you're exactly on the right path there, I think, because we've seen it throughout the ages.
Definitely. And it's good to just find some value in this stuff. It's, even though there's the whole countercultural thing, and of course we're exploring stories that are prior to Christianity, but written down post-Christianity, right? And so finding some use, some value symbolically from the bits that seem to have been put in there after the advent of Christianity, I think that's valuable and important. And it helps to appreciate the entirety of the story, as opposed to, well, let's not consider this and take it away just because it looks like it's the influence of Christianity. That's not useful. If it's put there for a reason, then that's good. And of course, maybe the reason is to be more pious and more aligned with the attitudes of the day as far as Christianity goes, but understanding that there's a purpose behind that too, I think that's worthwhile as well.
Definitely. I don't think, being pious or, and humble towards the greatest good is a bad thing at all. So, it fits right in.
Shall we finish it off?
I think so.
Okay. This is going to take us to the end, lines 547 to 586. Back to the poem. Then the aged Väinämöinen felt he had regained his vigor, and that he was healed completely, and his flesh again was solid, and beneath it all was healthy. In his body he was painless, and his sides were quite uninjured. From above the wounds had vanished, stronger felt he than aforetime. Better than in former seasons, on his feet he now was walking, and he could bend his knees in stamping. Not the least of pain he suffered, not a trace remained of aching. Then the aged Väinämöinen lifted up his eyes to heaven, gazing up to God most gracious, lifting up his head to heaven, and he spoke the words which follow, and expressed himself in this wise. Thence all mercy flows forever, thence comes aid the most effective. From the heaven that arches o'er us, from the omnipotent Creator. Praise to Jumala most gracious, praise to thee, O great Creator, that thy aid thou hast vouchsafed me, granted me thy strong protection, when my suffering was the greatest from the edge of sharpest iron. Then the aged Väinämöinen further spoke these words of warning. People, henceforth in the future, on your present welfare build not. Make no boat in mood of boasting, nor confide too much in boat ribs. God foresees the course of byways. The Creator orders all things. Not the foresight of the heroes, nor the might of all the great ones.
And so we finish it off with Väinämöinen not only being healed to his previous state of wholeness, but actually improved. He's feeling healthy. He's feeling stronger than he felt before, and better than in former seasons. He's actually improved by healing. And again, we see this a lot just in life when you go through a tough situation and you come out the other side and you're actually better for it. And, you're usually stronger, both like mentally and spiritually. Even working out, you go in and you tear yourself down to build yourself up, and you get stronger that way. Like unfortunately, that's how it seems to work for humans, that you have to tear things down first to build it back up in a stronger way. And then we finish off with Väinämöinen, praising Jumala and giving gratitude. And then with a little bit of a warning to people not to necessarily depend on their own greatness to do things, and don't do things that are boasting, but to always keep their eye on the prize of the greatest good, and which is, I think, a great way to end a poem about going through suffering and trying to make it to the other side.
Definitely. I am reasonably sure that warning in particular would have been added as an addition by Lönnrot, not originally there, especially in terms of moralizing. I don't think we have that much in kind of the original stuff, but still, it is a worthwhile warning in terms of the whole idea that things can just happen, and the idea that God sees everything. Maybe that's comforting, but we still do have agency, and that's the complicated part about all this, is that we do have agency, and Väinämöinen ultimately was the one who was doing it, but he was doing something kind of in error at the beginning. He shouldn't have been trying to woo the maid of Pohja. He should have been eye on the prize, which is, in the larger story, to get home to Kalevala and talk to Ilmarinen so he can forge the sampo for Louhi. And this is all we're going to visit that next time. That's going to be a fun one. That's going to be definitely it's actually going to be the conclusion of this cycle of the story. These first 10, they're considered the first cycle of the Kalevala. But here, wrapping this up, Väinämöinen is healed, and we heard some great stories about how technology was developed, iron in particular, and how healing processes were eventually discovered, and then giving gratitude to God or the highest good or the creator when they actually get it right and it works for someone. I don't blame them for that, because honestly, there would have been a lot of dying until they find something that works. And then I think they would have made note of that, but they would have also thanked God or the highest good or whatever for it, because that's a miracle. That's magic.
Absolutely. And we still do that today. When good things happen, even if you don't believe in anything higher, you might not necessarily say thank God, but there's still that feeling of deep gratitude for things going like your way. So, it could be something as easy as maybe there's construction on your street when you're leaving for work, and it's like, oh no, I might be a little bit late, but then you get all the green lights, and even something as small as that, you still have that feeling of gratitude, yeah, it worked out for me. This is great, So
we still do that today, exactly, but it's not. We still have the action, even if you're not necessarily directly within Christianity. It's an interesting concept. Even people who aren't religious in the majority religion still tend to act religiously, because the culture they've grown up in is so ingrained and so entrenched in this religion, or the foundation set by this religion. Even as Western society gets less and less religious, even though it's starting to make a rebound statistically, which is interesting, but people following no religion is definitely increasing. It's still not a case of we abandon all morality and all law and everything like that. And the foundations of that are within those religious structures, whether it's due to Judeo-Christian thought, which a lot of it is there, but there is also a huge contribution from pre-Christian ideals and thought, especially Germanic and Norse. Those hugely influenced our legal structures, our societal structures. So that's all there. But then even ideas of gratitude like that, we still act like that is real. And that's kind of cool. And acting like that is real, even if you don't necessarily think that there's a God who's responsible for it. It's still saying something like, thank goodness, or whatever. Even just that action, that's giving something in gratitude to some higher power or higher good that is greater than yourself. And having that on a psychological level is really interesting.
It is. I don't really have an answer for why it is like I don't have a good like materialistic answer for that, but no, we still do it, So
Well, the symbolic answer really just is that this is something so ingrained in us from way back that it's just something that's hard to get rid of, even if you believe that, say, God does not exist, or at the very minimum, you don't believe the current religious incarnations of whatever gods are out there. Well, hey, you still act like God is real. If God is just the highest good that you should be grateful to. So
absolutely. And you still feel that tremendous sense of like thankfulness when good things happen or things have been really bad and you finally make it to the other side and that weight is lifted off you and all that kind of stuff. So there's something there for sure.
definitely something there. I think that's it for this poem, though, and next time we'll see what happens when Väinämöinen is now able to continue on his journey home.
It'll be interesting to see what he does.
Absolutely. So, okay, before we close things out, just a reminder that we are sponsored by Grimfrost. And as we mentioned at the beginning, we're huge fans of theirs, our favorite source of Norse and Viking products. And like we said, they aim to build a bridge between the past and the present, bringing relevant parts of the Old Norse culture into today's world. And that's just something we are totally about. They have so many great products, whether it's historical recreations that were inspired by historical finds and things like that, or clothing that's kind of the period, or they have more modern things like just cool t-shirts and gym gear and all this other great stuff that's all Norse and Viking themed, and it's really cool. So that's all at grimfrost.com, and you can see everything they have available there.
Absolutely. It's definitely worthwhile. You can get all sorts of awesome things there.
Exactly. So again, a big thank you to Grimfrost, and I hope you check them out, grimfrost.com. The other way you can support the show is, of course, our Patreon page. It's always, every little bit is a huge support to the show. So if you want to support the show, you can do so there, patreon.com/Northern Myths. We're working on a whole bunch of upgrades to the show, trying to get better microphones so we sound a bit better. And we've got a whole big list of things that we might want to get to eventually. So we're making an even better product. And every little bit goes towards the show as well. So that's definitely the best way to support the show if you want to do so. We also have a merchandise store if you want to get some Northern Myths podcast themed stuff. So the link will be in the description for that. We have shirts and mugs and things like that with our designs. And we also have an Amazon affiliate program that's mostly due to the books and things, list of recommended books and music that we have on our website. And those things are, as mentioned, through the Amazon affiliate program, but they're books and music that we find valuable, books that have helped the show, books that have helped influence our ideas. And so that's definitely where you can go to get a little more information about what this show is based on. And so that's on our recommended books page on our website, and the music as well. And if you make a purchase after clicking on one of those links, we get a little bit of that. So that's always appreciated as well. Those are all great ways to support the show if you like. And the other thing is that you can get in touch with us over social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're Northern Myths Podcast or Northern Myths on all platforms. We're also personally on Twitter at NorthMythLuke and at NorthMythDan. We're on YouTube. And of course, if you subscribe on YouTube, that's always appreciated. Even if you listen to the podcast through a podcast app, if you take a quick look on YouTube, new subscribers is always helpful to us, gets our show out there a little bit better. And the other thing too is that reviews wherever you listen to your podcasts are always appreciated, especially on iTunes. So if you have a chance to just take a couple of minutes and write us a quick review, 5 stars is what we're looking for. And I wish I didn't have to say that, but that's the one that really gets us in front of more people. So, and the other thing too is that we do have an email address. If you aren't a fan of social media, we have our email address is northernmythspodcast@gmail.com, and we'll put that in the description as well. If you want to get in touch with us a little more personally, that's how you can do so at our email. I think that is everything, Dan, unless I'm missing something.
Well, that's most of it, but there is one thing. And it's the most important thing. And that's for you to go out and find the myth you're living.
This has been the Northern Myths Podcast. Thanks for listening.